What does an 18-year veteran of the tech industry and a 20-year veteran of the military have in common? More than you might think. Welcome, everyone, to the Second Act podcast, leveling up your life's journey. All right, welcome back to the Second Act podcast with Michael and John. We are super excited to have yet another guest speaker on our show today. John, how you doing?
Man, I'm doing good. I've heard a few stories over the past couple of days about people that have listened to our show and have been really fulfilled by the perspective from our guests. And we've had some really amazing guests that I can't even believe have been on the show, and today's no different.
And what's really cool is we've gone international. Like we've got
right,
folks
baby.
Listening across the world now. We have some upcoming guests in different parts of the world. But I don't want to take away from today's extra special guest who is going to be sharing his story. So why don't we jump into that, John, and get going?
Yeah. All right. Well, Michael, today we have Isaac Lee, Isaac Whiskey Lee. We'll dig into his call sign in a little bit, but Isaac grew up in Lubbock and joined the Marine Corps in 1997. After serving 20 years as an aviator across 7 deployments, Isaac left the Marine Corps and started pursuing his interest in business operations. He is now the Senior Vice President of operations for a small private retail company focused on express car washes, gas, and convenience stores with 23 active locations and 11 more locations slated to open in 2024.
That's pretty solid growth there.
Yeah. In addition to running operations, Isaac is on the board of Marine Executive Association and Support the Enlisted Project. He has a business consulting practice and is finishing up his memoir called Hangar 4, expected to be released in early 2024, where he describes in candid details the good, the bad, and ugly of his military experience. Isaac is a strong advocate for mental health support among the veteran community, and his transition out of the military faced some of the same overwhelming challenges as many. Too many choices in unfamiliar terrain, so he decided to focus on situation, not a job, to put his skills to work.
Nice.
Isaac currently resides in San Diego, California, and outside of work, he likes to spend time with his wife of 25 years, congrats, and their 2 children and close friends. His hobbies include fitness, playing amateur handyman around the house, and taking in a good baseball or football game. Welcome to the show, Isaac.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. I'm happy to be here. I've gotten to watch several episodes, so it's nice to be included in one.
Awesome. Hangar 4 sounds a little mysterious, like Area 51-ish. I don't know if there's a play on some UFO stuff or if this is something more practical here, but it's cool.
It's fairly practical. I was a career West Coast Siege 53 Echo pilot, and Hangar 4 is the hangar on Marine Corps Air Station Miramar where the Siege 53 Echo squadrons are housed. So for all of my career, that was the start and the finish line for every deployment, did my retirement ceremony there. So it's kind of a central place that the story continuously comes back to. And that's why I use it as the title.
Nice.
That's awesome. I've got to interject, so Isaac and I, this is for you, Michael, and for any of the listeners, but Isaac and I, we flew the same aircraft in the Marine Corps. I was just a couple years after him.
Okay.
And so I looked up to Isaac and what he was doing when I came in and started flying. But I was more of a bastard child in that I did not stay in one hangar my career. I morphed into multiple squadrons, multiple coasts, and got pushed around a lot. So I don't know what that has to say about me. Obviously, Isaac is a little bit more faithful, probably more trusted than I was. But, man, I am excited to hear about Hangar 4 and just let everyone else hear about the amazing things that Isaac has done in his career as a Marine, as well as post-Marine Corps, which has been, relatively short lived, right, since you've gotten out?
Yeah, coming up on almost 7 years now, which seems kind of crazy. It seems like yesterday and a million years ago at the same time sometimes.
Well, let's go back, Isaac. Let's let everyone hear, the things that helped create who you are today. And as I understand it, you grew up in Texas, and let's start with your childhood, growing up in the Lone Star State, and some of the important memories that shaped who you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. So grew up in Lubbock, Texas, smallish, dusty West Texas town, home to Texas Tech University, which is kind of the claim to fame.
Okay.
But, at the time it was a 5 high school town, so decent size. My dad was a football and baseball coach at one of the local high schools. So he was kind of a local celebrity, if you will. But our family growing up was totally focused on school and sports. My mom was also a teacher, so I got called my nurturing side from her, and all of the lessons, if you will, were on the dusty ball fields of West Texas with my dad. And that's where we spent our time. Frankly, there wasn't a whole lot else to do in Lubbock, Texas in the 80s and early 90s, so pretty much all the families were at some sporting event, year round. But it was a great way to grow up. I grew up with a lot of great kids and got a lot of competition, and I had no idea at the time, but it really prepared me well for what I went on to do as an adult in the Marine Corps specifically.
Are you the first in your family to join the ranks of the military?
My grandfather was in the Navy, but the military wasn't, call it a tradition in our family. I think my dad was hoping to turn the tradition into being athletes and coaches, and then I kind of hosed that up for him and went rogue and joined the Marine Corps a few years later. But it worked out.
Well, Isaac, I'm going to one up you here, and I, in maybe not a good way, but my dad got divorced when I was young, and he grew up in a smaller town outside of Lubbock called Tulia, Texas. It's in between Lubbock and Amarillo, because my dad went to Texas Tech as well. So growing up in Tulia, Texas, it's like the best thing about it is after it rains, it smells like rain and not cow poop. So I totally get growing up in the 80s or early 90s around the farm towns and really not having much to do but, create your own destiny out of the things you can find. So I admire that about you and coming up from that.
I appreciate that. And I am familiar with Tulia. I've driven through there many times.
It's about all you do there is drive through it.
I think a lot of people who aren't from Texas or don't have any ties to Texas, when they hear small town and sports, they think of that movie or series, Friday Night Lights, and football. And I don't know how close or far that is to where you guys have some ties to. But
it wasn't far away. And actually the year before Gary Gaines went to Odessa Permian, who's the coach in that movie and ultimately series, he and my dad went head-to-head in the playoffs. Gary Gaines was still at Monahans at the time. My dad was at Lubbock Dunbar. Game ended in a 0-0 tie, and Monahans won 1-0 on penetrations, which I didn't even realize that was a statistic until that game happened. I think I was 10 or 11 years old, mid-80s. But it was fun growing up in the middle of all that.
Very cool. Very cool.
Well, Isaac, so, your dad, you mentioned your dad was in the Navy. Do you have any aspirations as a young teenager, young adult, before you even get to Texas Tech? You think to yourself, I want to get out of here. I want to go do something else. I don't want, I want to leave this in the rearview mirror. Is there anything pushing you even before college that is leading you to a bigger world out there or joining the service?
I would say there was one tiny seed planted for me. So I will tell you, the whole time I was in high school, I went to a high school that had a very competitive baseball program. At the time, our coach he ended up retiring as the winningest high school baseball coach in the history of the United States. And he was already in his 30th season when I got there in the early 90s. And I was a decent baseball player. So my sole focus was, I'm going to play baseball for as long as I can, right? Just like every other kid thinks. But I did have a teacher, a government teacher when I was senior in high school, who was a retired Air Force colonel. And he kind of planted the seed a little bit with me. So that's the first time I really got it on the brain was there. And we had at the time, Reese Air Force Base was still in Lubbock, Texas. It was a training base. so we go to the air show or whatever every now and then, but it still felt like, I don't know, I wasn't connected to it. I was so focused on sports, I didn't really give it a whole lot of thought. And then the way just it shook out at the end of my senior year of high school, the only offers I got for baseball were really for junior colleges, but I was a good student. And probably the first great mature decision I made in my life was to not chase that from that point.
Okay.
There were a lot of guys in my hometown who were great high school athletes, and they were still banging around, and that was their claim to fame. And the one thing I knew I didn't want to do was that. But I didn't really have a plan on what I did want to do. So I went and enrolled in classes at Texas Tech, frankly, just because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. You're supposed to go to college, but I did that without any real clear idea of like, where am I going with this? What do I want to be when I grow up? I had no clue. But I got about 2-3 years. It was 3 years into that. I was doing an internship actually with an advertising agency in the summer, and I hated it. Like I couldn't stand it. And I went out to my parents' house one night. My dad was sitting in the driveway like he tended to do in the summer. And I started telling him like, hey, I'm doing this internship and I really don't like it and it's not going well and I don't want to do this. And, like a normal parent, he got pretty frustrated because he's like, look, you're 3 years into school, that we're helping you with, and now you're telling me you don't know what you want to do. Well, what are you going to do? And from my parents' driveway, you could see the landing pattern over at Reese Air Force Base, and the T-37s and T-38s were in the pattern doing some night training. And I just randomly looked over there and said, you know what? I'm going to do that. And he said, you're going to do what? And I was like, I'm going to be a pilot in the military. And he looked at me like it was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever said to him. And it was a fair reaction given the randomness of the comment at the time.
Yeah.
And he just got up and he went in the house and he didn't say anything. He didn't say, you can't do that. He didn't say, that's a great idea. He said nothing. And right then in that moment, I was like, I'm doing it. I don't know how, but I'm going to figure it out. And that's really what set me on the course to end up as going into the Marine Corps with an aviation contract.
Now being a parent yourself, have you reenacted some of this experience with your own kids where they just do a hard right and do something like, hey, I have this great idea, Dad. I'm gonna go try this thing that was not on the radar for anybody. Have you had?
I have,
Okay.
And I would say the biggest lesson I learned in that was after I decided to do that, I started telling people this is what I'm going to do, and almost unilaterally, all of them had the same reaction my dad did. They looked at me like I was insane. They told me I couldn't do that. They were like, have you ever seen how many gauges are in an aircraft? Like, it was like this state of disbelief. Like, I think literally the list of people that thought I could pull it off was me and to some degree my mother. And that was pretty much it. So that's what I share with my kids is, hey, you can do anything you want to do if you're willing to like just put in the work. And as long as you believe you can do it, you've got a shot. Like, that's the only thing that matters. Doesn't matter if anyone else thinks you can do it. If you think you can do it and you're willing to put in the work, you've got a shot. So go shoot your shot. And I tell them that all the time.
Awesome. So you join the Marines, you're an aviator, or you're starting to be an aviator, exploring all these buttons and mechanisms. Tell us about that early part of that journey.
Yeah, I mean, like everyone else, you first show up, and I didn't really know much of anything about the Marine Corps. And from the time I told my dad this is what I want to do till I literally got to officer candidate school, it was 2 years. So I had 2 years to do homework and prep, and you still don't know what you don't know. You show up there at Quantico just as clueless as everybody else. And really my initial game plan was just, hey, pay attention to the guys around you. Figure out who knows what's going on and just do what they do. That'll keep you off the radar, at least until you kind of have a clue what's happening. And so that was really my approach. Worked out okay. Went to flight school and kind of had the same approach there. Was just, hey, I don't know how this is going to go, but if I just work as hard as I can possibly work, then I can live with however it works out. And that was really my approach the whole way through. And then, it worked out well for me, and I actually ended up doing pretty well. And then by the time I got to the fleet, because flight school is a process, I went to officer candidate school summer 97, and it was December of 2000 when I got to my first fleet squadron at Miramar. So my timing was either amazing or terrible, depending on your perspective. That was about 10 months prior to 9/11 happening. So I got there just in time, and looking at it that way, one of my first deployment, 9/11 happened while I was on my first deployment, and then from there we're fighting a war. So it was an interesting time to come into the Marine Corps and in any occupational specialty, but I just kind of grew up in Iraq and Afghanistan from that point forward.
Man, I want to go back for just a second, Isaac, because I'm laughing the whole time you're telling this story because our stories are so similar. I was a junior working at a marketing company, and I had just gotten a job offer. They said, hey, when you graduate from college, we'll let you come back here and work, and we'd love to have you. And I was an intern. And I'm thinking to myself, I was born in Tulsa. I grew up in Tulsa. I'm going to college in Tulsa. Now I've got offered a job. This is great. I'm going to be here my whole life. Yeah. And this is so easy. And life isn't as hard as people make it out to be. And I sat there thinking at my desk one day, wait a sec. I'm 20 years old. I've never left this place. I've got no idea what else is out there. I'm barely making it in school. I can't follow the rules at school. And I went to the recruiter. I came home with a bunch of pamphlets from the Marine Corps and aviation pamphlets. And I set them on my table. And my dad comes and looks over my shoulder. He's like, what is that? And I said, Dad, I think I want to join the Marine Corps. And he laughs. And he says, yeah, we'll see how long that lasts. Because here I am. I'm going to a small Christian school in Tulsa, Oklahoma that has a dress code. And I'm getting fines and penalties because I can't follow the rules. And here I tell him I'm going to join the Marine Corps. And it was almost his disbelief in what I thought I was going to do that convinced me this is what I'm going to do. So our moments, with our dads where they're kind of sitting there and just, in awe. Where in the hell did these guys come up with this decision? It's kind of what pushed me over, just like you.
Yeah,
so
it's a great motivator. And my dad actually embraced it after the fact. By that point, he got out and coached him as a principal, but he actually turned that whole encounter into a class he used to give his teachers called Don't Ever Tell a Kid They Can't Do Something. And he was just really happy he didn't say, you can't do it, even though his body language and his expression, everything else says you can't do it. But it was a good moment for us and one I'll never forget for sure.
Well, so I know I've got the next question, and it's kind of how you transition out of the Marine Corps, but I want to cut real quick to you in the military because you and I know something that a lot of other people don't, and that's the pace of life that we were living in. Again, I'm 5 years after you, but during this time that America is going to war, dual wars, pace of life is ridiculous. And I don't know if yours was like mine, but you go on a deployment 7 to 8 months, you come back, you have a couple months to breathe, and then you're right back in it. You're getting ready to go back to war. You're going back. Okay. And you kind of have to put your life on pause, which can be great in some regards. It can be really detrimental in others, but 7 deployments over 20 years, and a lot of them were probably in the very early stages of your career. What does that do to you? How do you respond to that?
It was I'll call it a transformational experience. And it was also just difficult because, my wife and I had only been married for a few years. I did my first deployment was to Okinawa, Japan. 9/11 happened while I was there. Big spool up. We didn't really do anything. Ended up coming back to the States, regrouped, and then deployed to OIF 1, the initial kickoff, almost a year later. But from there, the pace of everything changed, like you said. I ended up doing 3 deployments to Iraq over the course of 3 years. The stops at home were pretty short. Our daughter had been born right before I went the first time. She was premature. She was in the hospital for a couple months. I mean, life just got real crazy. We had this premature baby, and it seemed like the next thing you know, I was on this ship headed to war. And then I just kept going. So that period, I would say, was extremely challenging, for many ways, in many ways. But I was also, you kind of undergo this transformation through that experience. You kind of start out as a nervous lieutenant, can I do this? Because you don't really know, while you're on a ship headed to Iraq, am I going to be able to literally do my job when I get there? Or am I going to, just shut down? You start there, and then you start getting confident, and then you start having all these conflicting feelings oh, wow, I actually like this. Wait, I'm not supposed to like this. Am I crazy? You go through this total transformation, and, a couple years later, you spit out, and you're this iron captain that's kind of a smart aleck and thinks he knows everything and has been there and done that. And then you have to kind of reconcile that. And So I did all of those things, and it was just like this crazy whirlwind. And by the time that was done, I had a daughter who was 3 years old that I barely knew. In fairness, my wife was not too pleased about the way the last 3 years had gone. It was hard. It's still hard. So then we took orders to the schoolhouse at Mott's One, where I was instructor. That was a pretty good little reset for us, kind of caught our breath, went through a 1-year master's program, and then I was right back in the fleet as a major, which had its own conflicts because, I grew up as a young officer thinking all majors were terrible and didn't know what they were doing, and I was one. So I was like, oh, I have to hate myself now. I'm one of those. But it was great. It turned me into who I was. And then I took a deployment to Afghanistan, which was an incredible experience, and then did another Marine Expeditionary Unit detachment. And it was just like this never-ending thing that was going on. Somewhere in there we had our son and decided to continue on in the Marine Corps. Still arguably a questionable decision in the middle of all of that. But it worked out, and then ultimately ended up in command of a squadron at the end of my career, which is really kind of felt surreal to me. I would have never imagined when it started that that's how it would end up. But it was a ride for certain. It was definitely a ride, and it definitely changed a lot as a person along the way. And it's just an experience like that is so extreme. It definitely has an effect on who you are and who you end up being. But it was important to me to figure all that out, on the backside and make sure I turned it into as much of a positive as possible as I could.
So, John and Isaac, you both have spent quite a bit of time in the military. You have orders to get deployed. You go through these transformational personal journeys, and both of you have families that you're leaving behind for long periods of time. The other side of that equation is, your wife is home with the kids, and help people who are non-military folks understand how that community works and the support there that happens while you guys are deployed, just to paint the whole picture of what's going on in these series of events.
But it really is a community, and the squadron and all the spouses and everyone who stays back, they definitely do everything they can to take care of each other. And there's a lot of goodness in that, and it's necessary. But I would say, and John can totally chime in on this, it still is difficult for your personal relationship with your spouse, with your kids, because it's not a switch you can flip. So once you start making that transformation into a warfighter, for lack of a better way to put it, it's not something you turn off even when you're home and come through the gate and come home, So you're sort of living this in this parallel universe where on one side of the coin you're a warfighter, and on the other side you're supposed to be like this normal guy in the suburbs with his wife and kids, and it's a really difficult thing to do well. Very difficult.
Isaac, I've talked about it on the show before, but for us, you and I and service members, deployments to us are kind of like the Super Bowl. It's what we've trained to do over and over and over. We've spent nights and days and countless hours doing workups away from home, and now we get to go do this thing. So for us, the service member, it's this shot of adrenaline because you're getting to test yourself, test your skills. It's a unique experience where you're with, 24 to 32 of these other pilots day in and day out for 8 months. I mean, they are your family. And it's this kind of microcosm of a family away from your family. And so you go and it's exciting and, there's a lull in there, but then you get ready to come home and that's exciting. And then you get back and our spouses have been doing the same thing day in and day out. God bless them, raising kids, getting them to school, making lunches, making dinners, doing laundry. And we kind of come back and we're like, we like Isaac said, we kind of just want to jump back into it. And it's weird because it's not the same thing. It's not the Super Bowl. It's life, and it's even more fulfilling, but there's just things that are sometimes missing, but sometimes more rewarding. And so it's really weird to come back and try to integrate. But I really always try to do exactly what Isaac has done and applaud our spouses who have stayed back, our family members who have supported us from afar. the kids who have grown up without, mothers and fathers for a period of time, because that toll is pretty
That's tough.
impactful. Yeah, it is. It's unique. And that's why I wanted to talk about Isaac's experience, because he deployed several more times than I did over even a tighter timeline. So I knew that impact was going to be significant. And maybe you can touch on it when we get to your book. But I also want to capture two things while we're here. And Isaac mentioned being at MOTS 1. And for those of you that don't know, you've got Top Gun. That's the Navy warfighter school for aircraft, for fixed wing pilots. MOTS 1 is the Marine Corps' version of Top Gun. They bring in the best of the best of aviators and logistics officers and all the warfighting traits across the Marine Corps, and they put them in this incubator for a couple months. And they come out these just amazing warfighting leaders. And so the fact that Isaac went, one as a student and then went back as an instructor is pretty significant. And he just barely touched on it. So I wanted to bring awareness to that. I mean, he's literally best of the best when he comes out of that school, and then he gets asked to go back and instruct. So kudos to Isaac for that accomplishment.
I have to ask, being a Top Gun fan, were you ever inverted?
No, if you'd have been inverted in a helicopter, that's bad.
It can't happen, right? There's like the
you can do it once.
physics. Yeah.
Yeah, not a good idea.
I want to also, while we're talking about Isaac, give us the 2-minute version. Your call sign's whiskey. We've talked about call signs before on the show. Navy and Marine Corps aren't usually nice with how they hand out call signs, but how did you get whiskey?
Honestly, like most call signs, it was the least intelligent thing that I did while I was a young captain in the fleet. But it was right after we won OF1. We were having a Steel Beach picnic on the Navy ship that we called home, and so it was they called a beer day. So everyone you get a couple beers, which is something you're not really supposed to do on a Navy ship, is drink. But that kind of escalated and turned into, call it a bit of a party, and people had some secret stashes that started making an appearance. And I was just fortunate enough to be one of the lucky ones that got identified as breaking the rules. So I stood a lot of duty on the way home and thought I might be in super serious trouble. And I kind of was for a little bit, but nothing that left too much of a mark. But I got a cool call sign out of it. So in the end, my call sign was whiskey because I got in trouble for drinking on the boat. But at least the call sign itself made it worthwhile going through that experience.
That is one of the better ones I've heard, Isaac. So congrats on that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So again, let's go back to military career. Phenomenal career. 7 deployments, 20 years of service. You went to MOTS 1. You went back and were asked to instruct at MOTS 1. And then towards the end of your career, you get asked to command a squadron. So 300 plus Marines, 15 plus or minus a couple aircraft that you're in charge of. And you're running the squadron on a day-to-day basis, deploying with that squadron. You've hit every wicket that a Marine Corps aviator would want to hit.
I did.
So just tell me, before you leave the Marine Corps, tell me about how you're feeling right now.
Well, it was awesome to get slated for command. Was truly an honor. I loved every second of it. But I kind of went into that tour knowing that I had kind of reached my end point. Like, I felt like at that time, the best thing I could do for really my family and for me would be to go ahead and transition out when that was complete. And it was really more of a personal decision than a professional decision. Just the age my kids were at the time, I knew if I stayed and kept going, and I was in a good position to do that. Odds are decent. I would have gotten promoted at least one more time, but it was going to be another 2 or 3 moves at a time when our daughter was a teenager. So that was kind of weighing on me, not to mention just I felt like the pace that I'd been on for that entire time my wife and I had never really had an opportunity to really reconcile any of those things. It was just a never ending, go to the next thing, go to the next thing, go to the next thing. And it always felt like we were putting off, I don't want to say dealing with it, but kind of, right? There were things we needed to reconcile and really try to address as individuals and together as a couple and as parents, with our kids. And I was just really concerned that if I tried to keep going, that we were going to reach a point where that we wouldn't have a chance to make that work out well. And that was really the heart of the decision for me. And it was difficult because I loved being in the Marine Corps and I love the mission, and I always will and always think of it fondly. But I just got to this place personally where I felt like you need to go do something else when you're done with this command tour. And frankly, I also just kind of like the idea of, to that point, my career had gone about as well as it could. And I was very aware that your Marine Corps career, really any military career, ends one of two ways. You either end it on your terms when you're ready, or eventually they tell you, hey, thanks, but we don't really need you around here anymore. And I did like the idea of doing that on my terms, on my timeline.
Yeah.
And that did, it resulted in a few one-way conversations from senior officers after I made that decision, but I just kind of stuck to my guns and did it. I felt like it was going to be the best thing for me to do.
Man, let's talk about when you make that decision. And it's hard. And I always tell people, Marine Corps is an easy decision for Marines until it's not. Until, like you said, it came to a head and you're like, it's going to lead to some bad things down the road if we keep kicking that can. So then you decide with your wife, hey, this is it. This is where I'm going to go. And you decide to go into the private sector, and maybe you have another direction that you initially go, but let's talk about when you make that decision. The end date is getting closer and closer and closer. What is going through your mind? Because you know that a transition is inevitable. You know that something new is going to have to occur, and you're going to have to start again at the bottom. What's going through your mind?
Yeah, well, the transition was, it was an interesting experience. It was a great learning experience. But the way it worked out for me, I actually gave up command 1 year before my retirement date. So I had 1 year to kind of really get my stuff together. And I went up to work at our higher headquarters at the wing and operations. So I was still busy, but not nearly as busy as I'd been in command. So I had time. And I'm admittedly a huge nerd, and I tend to be overly prepared. So I was going to like every class and all these networking events, and I was just a sponge for about the first 2 or 3 months of that. And I kind of landed on this idea that what I was really most interested in, and the thing I'd really fallen in love with in the Marine Corps, was just the human component of that, the leadership, the taking care of people, the being part of a team. And I came to this conclusion that going into the operations lane of business would be the place where I could find that and keep doing it. All the other standard options were on the table, of course. There's an airline transition for rotary wing pilots. There's, a million jobs at DoD Company X that are just sucking up people like me. But I really didn't want to do that. I want to do something totally different. And similar to my decision to join the Marine Corps, pretty much everyone I said that to told me I was crazy and it doesn't work that way and you can't do that and go get in line at Lockheed like you're supposed to, et cetera, et cetera. But I was pretty undeterred by that because it was really the second time in my life where I was like, okay, this is where I want to do. So even if no one thinks I can do it, I'm going to figure this out.
I love the nonconformity that sort of goes all the way back to childhood. And you don't think of that in the military, especially not the Marines and then a pilot, but it's just like you have those moments and you just go for it. I love it.
Yeah. I mean, you could call me hard-headed or stubborn or ridiculous, but so far it seems to keep working for me, so I'm sticking with it. But I was still kind of struggling with this overwhelming feeling of like, there's a million jobs. What do I want to do? And then it finally dawned on me one day that I was looking for a situation, not a job. So to me, that situation was small company that's trying to grow, preferably that has a lot of issues that need to be solved. Because kind of my idea, if you will, was that the soft skills, like the things I just knew, the people, the leadership part, making, process improvement, I could make an impact right away while I was learning the business. And once I was able to see it that way, I was able to focus my networking on situations that look like that. And it ended up being fruitful. So networked my way into meeting a CEO of a company. It's a manufacturing company here in North County, San Diego, and ultimately got hired to be their chief operating officer a few months before my actual retirement. So it worked out kind of perfect where I literally did my retirement ceremony on a Friday. I took 1 week off, and then I walked into this company and I was the chief operating officer in a total fake it till you make it scenario, admittedly. Like, listen more than you talk, take a lot of notes. When in doubt, Google's your friend, and, take care of the people. And that's really where it started. And I just worked a ton to get, my arms around it as quickly as I could. And I did, and it worked out.
I love the look for a situation, not a job. I mean, I think that's a perspective that so many people should think about, and a lens people should look through when they're pursuing first, second, third, fifth act, whatever they're doing in life, because it's it makes you do some reflection on your skill sets and your passion and where to direct that in the things that you're doing, so that you'll do the best job as possible. And now you're in your second act after the military, and you've applied that perspective to what you want to do next, and now you're running operations for a growing small private retail company. Tell us about your foray into that particular world.
Yeah, for sure. So I was at the manufacturing company for about a year when I got to a point where I honestly started to get kind of bored, because we'd gotten everything, it was running pretty well. And I admittedly have learned this about myself. I'm sort of attracted to chaos, and I like things that are like kind of go in 1,000 different directions and try to get it all on, pointed in the same direction. So things at my first company were going well. And I was starting to get bored. So I got this bright idea that I was going to start this little consulting company and go around and help a bunch of small companies, do this same thing. And I was just getting that going, and just randomly got a call from someone who's I think of as a mentor, and was like, "Hey, there's a company looking for an ops guy. You should take the meeting." That's all he said. And he later told me that that's all he said because he knew if he included the words car wash, I probably wouldn't go take the meeting. So next thing I know, I'm sitting down with the owner, CEO of this company, and at the time he was just about to open his 11th location. He had car washes, some convenience stores, gas stations, and he kind of had this big idea of, hey, I want to turn this into like a real thriving, growing business. It sounded difficult, which was attractive to me, and he really wanted to try to establish a good culture with the team. And doing that in a company that's doing car wash and convenience store sounded to me like extremely difficult, which made it even more attractive. And so I was like, yeah, let's do this. So I actually worked for him as a consultant for a few months, and then ultimately worked out a situation where I became a full-time employee. So I've been there, ever since, and we've more than doubled the size of the company in terms of locations and employees and all of those things. And we're still going, 90 miles an hour now. So, and there's enough chaos there to keep me entertained. So I've stayed there longer than I anticipated for that reason, which is also good.
And are all the locations owned by the parent, or are they actually franchised out in some spots? What's the model look like?
Yeah, it's just a private company. It's his baby to this day. So yeah, he owns the whole thing. Just our team is much bigger than it was when I started, but it's been fun. I mean, we kind of started at ground zero and looked at everything, and my leash was probably a lot longer than it should have been, but just immediately started revamping processes and procedures and how do we do things and how do we approach our teams and talent and all of that stuff. So it's the way it functions today is very different than it did in the early stages, but in a good way. So it's been a fun project to be part of.
So there he is, Isaac, fresh out of the Marine Corps, solves all the problems at a manufacturing company, rolls over to a car wash company, grows it double size, fixing all those problems, and he decides, you know what, I'm going to write a book. And you're writing a memoir. It's slated to come out later this year about your time as an aviator in the Marine Corps. What the heck, man? What inspired you to do that? Where did you find the time?
Yeah.
And then what are you hoping readers take away from the book once they put it down?
No, that's a great question. Thanks for asking. So admittedly, I tend to stay too busy for my own personal good. I'm one of those people. So I generally only stop doing something, like literally when I go to bed. It's not necessarily good, but I can't help it. That's just me being me. But I actually kept a journal the entire time I was in the Marine Corps. And I'd found early on that writing was just a good exercise for me. I like to write. I don't know that I'm particularly good at it, but the exercise was good. So I had chronicled my entire career. And because I'm a super nerd, it was all electronic and categorized and neat and easy to go back and look at. But I had this thing, and I never really had a plan for it. I mean, when I was still in the Marine Corps, I used to joke around with people that I was going to write a book someday and give them a ridiculous fake name or something. But I had this journal, but I didn't really have a reason to do it, and I didn't have, honestly, the time. So those first few years I was out in the Marine Corps, I was so busy building my next career and doing these things, I didn't think about it a lot. But what ended up happening was, for me personally, I felt like it was important for me as an individual to go back and unpack my combat experience. And so that was actually part of my personal transition. When I started working on transition in professional terms, I also started working on personal terms. So I started going to counseling at a vet center here in San Marcos, California, like right away. As I was doing all the same transition prep, going to networking meetings and stuff. And I did that because I felt like what to me was normal and okay, but I knew that the experience was such that I didn't want to like come back and sneak up on me later, become problematic later. Sure. So I did that preemptively, and it was one of the best decisions I've ever made, ever, for myself, for sure. So fast forward a few years, I've got this journal. I still sort of have this idea for a book, but honestly, I was still in the land of like, why would I write this? Like, who cares? Who are you to write, this book, this memoir, right? Like, that was really the voice in my head. But in 2021, I started hearing more and more about, honestly, peers and just other Marines I knew that were having a hard time in transition and on the backside of transition in multiple ways, having trouble finding their path professionally, substance abuse, marital issues, all those things. And it was still challenging for me to navigate some of those things in my own personal life. So I know this is happening. I'm becoming more aware that it's happening. And I felt like, wow, I know what's going on with them. What can I do to help? And so you're trying to reach out to people and tell them, what you've done or what might help them, and just be the best friend you can be. But I finally just came to the conclusion, like, hey, maybe this is my why. Maybe I should write this story. And maybe if I share this story in like a really honest way, it can be helpful to some of my peers and, other service members, veterans, and honestly, even their families. If I'm really open about, hey, this was what this experience was like for me, and this is ultimately how it impacted me, and this is, sort of what I ultimately decided to do about it, going forward. So that was really my motivation. And once I had that, then it was actually, I won't say easy, but once I knew why I wanted to do it, then I just sat down and went back through my journal and put it together. So pretty exciting to get it to this point, because for a long time, it was just this thing I was doing in my office by myself, and you're kind of jamming on this thing forever and ever, and pages. And I'm thinking, like, is this terrible? I have no idea. So it was neat to finally get to a point where, working with a publisher and a professional editor, get it cleaned up. And really, it was kind of scary the first time I sent it out to some endorsement readers. It was the first real feedback you get. And like, well, we'll see what happens here. This might have been the most terrible thing I've ever done. We'll find out soon. But it was good to start getting feedback there. And that's all been, knock on wood, resoundingly positive so far. So I'm hopeful that it'll be something that ultimately helps people.
So you've memorialized your experience through this book, and you described sort of seeing the elements that maybe were a recipe for disaster and preemptively sort of attack that in your own experience that is included in the book. And adjacent to that, you help advocate for mental health. Share a little bit more about your passion, based on that community, especially those who are making that military transition, and so much is unknown outside of the world they know, and that is so structured for them while they're in the military. It's, even if you wanted to get into something specific in the book that you think might resonate with our audience.
Yeah, well, what I was really trying to do, and I'm certainly not telling anyone exactly what to do or how to do it. I was just trying to be really open and honest and share, like, this was my experience. And kind of touched on a little bit earlier, but, you started as kind of a nervous young lieutenant. You turned into this iron captain that thinks he knows everything. Now you're a major and you're in charge of stuff. But at the same time, I was starting to recognize that the way the experience was affecting me was probably not necessarily good, in that I wasn't scared of anything, like, at all. I actually liked it. I wanted more of it. If, there was a point in my life, if you'd have told me you can go fly the craziest mission in the world every night for the rest of your life, I would have said, yes, sign me up. But at the same time, the logical part of my brain is like, that's probably not good. Like, that, maybe that's not the best thing for you long term, that you've come to this place where this is what you love. Like, and it was, it was almost like I described it as an addiction that I had to that. Uh-huh. And so the further I went, the more aware of that I became, and the more I started thinking to myself, like, hey, you probably need to see if you can understand this and understand yourself a little better going forward, just to ensure that it doesn't manifest itself into something else that's a really negative thing, because you're not going to be able to fly these aircraft forever. You're not going to have this outlet, if you will, available to you to get this rush or this high or this thing you've come to know that you love so much. So instead of just, going cold turkey and not flying anymore and hoping it all works out, like, you probably need to give some thought to this. And that was really my motivation to do that.
Interesting.
And to understand, okay, how do I unpack this in a way that helps me stay, who I need to be going forward and be the best version of myself for everyone else going forward. And so that's really, call it the story.
Yep.
All the things that happened, the Marine Corps things, are really just sort of the adventures that are happening and moving the timeline and the story along. And then I'd say the other story that I was very honest about was just what we were talking about earlier, how challenging it is to raise a family while you're doing that and maintain some semblance of a normal personal life while you're moving in and out of the combat zone and going on deployments and training detachments and trying to exist in two worlds simultaneously. So it's a pretty honest look at all of those things.
You guys talked about being at the top of your game in the Marine Corps as aviators and sort of that thrill or rush, because you get to be so good at your job. You're sort of chasing the next big thing to go after on that side of the equation. And there's some parallels to elite athletes that you sometimes see in the news, that they start to think they're invincible and that nothing can go wrong. They've conquered these huge mountains in the athletics world, only to self-destruct at some point and see their personal life sort of turn into a disaster. So you preemptively sort of pursuing ways to address that, and then having that come out in the book and sharing that with the world, Isaac. I commend you on that, on pursuing that and getting that out there.
Yeah, thank you. I thought it was just an important thing to share, and I think it'll sound familiar to a lot of people, and a lot of family members of those people, and certainly in the military community, but I do think there's a parallel there with athletes, and also, what I've come to learn is with founders, CEOs, high-level business people, or a lot of them are wired the same way, take great risk, a great reward, and have a lot of success, and all of that success, has a tendency to convince you that you're 10 feet tall and bulletproof. And to a degree, you kind of need to believe that to do it in the first place.
Yep.
But then at some point, you got to kind of come down off of that and do what you got to do to help yourself turn back into a rational person, right? The best version you can be before you take it a little too far in the wrong place.
Isaac, if you would, I want to talk real quick about your transition out of the military. And you talked about getting some self-help, and you're pursuing making yourself whole. But I imagine that's got a bigger impact on your wife, and that's affecting in a positive way. It's affecting your relationship. and now you're able to find time to reconnect in a positive way with your kids. So talk about transition and writing this book and how it's affected you and your relationships with your family.
It's good, and I will say, I'll be totally honest and tell you, it's still hard. Like when you do something like that for that amount of time, it takes time to then sort of reconcile it on the backside. Not so much with your kids, because your kids are your kids, and you're their dad, or I'm their dad, and then that's a little easier to broach. But you have to obviously be aware of that this experience had an effect on them too. But that one was a little easier. It's more complex, I think, in a marriage, and a marriage is complex in the best of circumstances. So for both my wife and I to kind of come at that from, a personal perspective for ourselves, and then a joint perspective is definitely, I would say, is an ongoing project that we talk about often and work on in a lot of different ways. To both help ourselves kind of keep that in as healthy a place as possible and on a positive trajectory moving forward. But it's certainly easier said than done, and it's definitely something that is an ongoing project. And sometimes I think it'll always be an ongoing project to some degree, because there's some things that just are. I can't change 2005, and neither can she. So you both have to kind of come to your own peace with some of the things as they transpire. Just, it's hard to do.
Yeah. I'll say you've echoed in this conversation a lot of the sentiment that I have talked about in several of the shows before. And when Michael and I were first starting out, it was just one-on-one.
Yeah.
We talked a lot about a lot of the things that you have experienced. So I'm glad you're not making a liar out of me and making it also just showing how true these experiences are, and how sometimes deeply wounded people can be when they come out of such a long stint in the military and not even really know it, and not even really know the effect they've got on their families. So I appreciate you conveying that here today.
Yeah,
Definitely.
absolutely. I think it's important to have open conversations about it. I mean, just not only to help each other, but, there's a lot of people out there that have experienced really challenging circumstances for different reasons, and hopefully it's helpful for them too.
Yeah. With that said, as we start to wrap things up, Isaac, whether it's military veterans or any person who's had that sort of inflection point and decided they wanted to do something different for the benefit of them and their family, or professionally, they just wanted something more fulfilling. What are some of the practical things that you can leave them with in those early days, early steps, moving forward into the seemingly unknown world?
Well, I do think, if you could think of it as a situation, not a job, that helps, and not necessarily even a situation for tomorrow, but where do I ultimately want to be, and what situation puts me on that path to get there? And then from there, I think really the most important thing is just to lean into your network, and everyone has a network of people, whether they realize it or not, that are willing to help them. And I think people, as corny as it might sound, are generally good and willing to help if you'll ask. And so just starting those conversations and reaching out to people and looking for advice and guidance, like you'll get it, and people will help you. And then in turn, you'll end up helping someone else or many people down the road in return. But, those things will help you get where you want to go. But at the end of the day, it really is going to come down to believe it in yourself and being willing to put in the work. I tell my kids all the time, like, hey, if you do these 3 things, you'll probably be fairly successful. Just be on time, have a good attitude, and try. Like, that's it. If you do those 3 things, you'll be okay at just about anything you pursue. So, I've always taken that to heart, and I'm definitely a product of someone who just was willing to put in the effort and give it a shot.
The beauty and the simplicity of that, but it's so effective. We all should remind ourselves of those things every day. And I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, Isaac, man, thanks so much for giving us a brief insight into what made you you, and how you became excellent at what you're at what you did in the Marine Corps and now outside in the civilian sector. And thanks for coming on the show, sharing more about your life and some of the exciting things you're working on. You have some really cool things in the works. Hangar 4 is the book you're working on. It's coming out later this summer or later this spring, I guess. But I'm sure there's many listeners that want to stay closer to the things you're working on, as well as learn more about you. So if people want to find you, what's the best way that they can do that?
Easiest way to find me, honestly, is on LinkedIn. It's Isaac Lee, fairly easy to find, San Diego. And then I have a website set up for the book that's isaacglee.com, and that'll take you to all my other socials if you want to learn more about the book. And that'll be out on April 9th. So I'll be doing, some more interviews and events leading up to that and after it comes out. But we're excited for that part. It'll be fun to see how that goes once it's out in the world.
We're proud to say that we're first.
Yes.
We're the first one to interview
Not that
Isaac.
we're competitive.
You are. You are. This is the
pre-release
the
of the book. So we're excited about that.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Man,
I really appreciate it.
I'll tell you.
Likewise,
I'll
Isaac.
tell you, this brief hour with you has been so invigorating for me, just to have a flashback into time and my experience in the Marine Corps and flying helicopters. But again, like I said earlier, to hear that we're not alone. There's so many stories out there like this of people that have given it their all, that put in everything, and then are working on that transition. And sometimes it's graceful, sometimes it's very ugly. I too am in my own transition and working my way into that second act. And so it's such a benefit to have people like you who will open themselves up and share truthfully and honestly the things that are going on and provide some assistance and provide some advice. And so again, thank you so much for being on the show and just really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you guys. It's been great. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Isaac. We're going to watch your book take off and join the New York Times top 10 list soon, I think.
That's right.
That'd be something.
Right.
I'll take it if it happens.
Okay.
Well, we wish the best to you, Isaac, and the book launch and the podcast that you're going to be on, and we'll be sure to include the link when it's available to the book and to your LinkedIn page and where people can find out more about you. We'll have those in the show notes, in our podcast notes as well. So, man, thank you so much, and Michael, it's great to see you again, and I look forward to this episode coming out. And looking forward to seeing you next week.
Awesome. Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks, Isaac. Thanks, John. We will see you all next week.
All right. Thank you, guys.
See ya.
Take care.
The Second Act with Michael and John stars Michael Newborn and John Ballenger. The podcast is produced by Seltzer Kings. For more information on the show, check out michaelandjohn.com, or if you'd like to get involved in the conversation, give the guys a shout on their socials at The Second Act with Michael and John on most platforms. Thanks for listening.